Have you ever met anyone who has seemingly contradictory personality traits? Sometimes we meet people, and as we get to know them, we learn what their personality traits are. We know what they're like. We get to know maybe a few features about these people that we meet, and we notice in some people there's these traits that just don't seem to make sense together. They don't work well together. Have you ever met someone like a shy extrovert or someone like that? Someone who enjoys going out and being with other people and spending time with other people, but when they're out there and when they're involving themselves with other people, maybe they're just a bit reserved, or maybe they're a bit quiet, or they don't necessarily know how to engage in those social interactions. A shy extrovert, or someone who you know to be an extremely intelligent person, but also is very naive when it comes to situations. They have a lot of sense about them, but when it comes to understanding people and understanding the ways of the world, they're just very naive. And you think, how can someone who is so intelligent at the same time be so naive? One of the things that gets me is when you see some people at the gym and they've spent a lot of time, maybe sculpting their figure or making sure they've got really big arms or something like that. They look very muscular. But then when you actually need their help to lift a piece of furniture or something like that, they can't actually do it. People who have big muscles but don't actually have any strength about them. It's seemingly contradictory traits. A shy extrovert, someone who's at the same time very intelligent or very naive, or people with big muscles who can't lift anything. Sometimes we meet these people, we get to know these people, and we understand their traits, and sometimes we struggle to wrap our heads around these contradictions. How does this work? How can this person both be so intelligent and also so naive? How can they be so interested in meeting other people, but when they do meet other people, they don't know how to act, they don't know how to engage in those conversations? People do the same thing with God, particularly with his attributes of his justice and his mercy. They ask this question: how can God be both just and merciful? How can a God be holy and just and expect a certain standard of holiness from his people, but also be merciful and forgiving and gracious? How do these two traits work together? Again, as we meet people and we struggle to wrap our heads around these, a lot of people struggle to wrap their heads around these two seemingly contradictory traits of justice and mercy. I think the way we often view God, we'll either view God in one of two ways. We either view him as a wrathful judge, or we view him as a loving father. And there's kind of these two contrasting sides to God, and we actually read about both of them in Scripture. If we turn in our Bibles to the book of Isaiah, chapter 13 and verse 9. Isaiah 13 verse 9 says, "Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it." We see God depicted there as a wrathful judge, bringing justice. And if we read the whole book of Isaiah or many of the prophets, that's how we see him depicted, as this angry and just judge. But we also read, if we turn to Psalm 103 and verse 13, we see a very different picture. Psalm 103 and verse 13 reads, "As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him." So which one is it? Is God a wrathful judge, full of holiness and justice? Or is God a merciful father, full of grace and compassion? Today, as we're going to be looking at this attribute of mercy in the series, Daniel mentioned to me you're going through what must I do to be saved, and particularly you're up to this attribute of mercy, this attribute of mercy. And I kind of thought about mercy and how it operates in our salvation, how we receive mercy from God. So what I want to do this morning is I want to look at God's attribute of mercy from Exodus chapter 34. Exodus chapter 34 and verse 6 and 7, which was just read to us earlier. This proclamation, this is God speaking, proclaiming his own name, proclaiming his own goodness. It comes in the context of Moses requesting to see God's glory. If we turn back a few pages to Exodus 33, Exodus 33 verse 18 to 20 says, Moses said, "Please show me your glory." And he said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." It's a very interesting kind of conversation there between Moses and God, because Moses says, "I want to see all your glory. Show me your glory." And God basically responds with, "No, I'm not going to show you my glory." Because the reality is, you can't see my glory and live. Moses, just like any of us, cannot experience the fullness of God's glory. But what God is willing to show is he says, "I will make all my goodness pass before you." So Moses can't handle all of God's glory, but God does want to demonstrate and show all his goodness. God is willing to show the depth of his goodness to Moses. And that's the context of this. Moses wants to see God's glory. God says, "No, I'm not going to show you my glory, but I will show you my goodness, and I will proclaim before you my name." And then the passage that was read for us in Exodus chapter 34, verse 6 and 7, is God expounding on what his goodness is. He expounds on, "This is my goodness." And I think what we see in that proclamation, we see very clearly the attributes of mercy and the attributes of justice, and how they work together and how they harmonize with one another there at Mount Sinai. So let's look at this text then. Let's look at this passage in Exodus chapter 34, verse 6 and 7. He proclaims there both his mercy and his justice. And I think it's kind of like when you meet that person who has contrasting traits. You read things like he's merciful, he's gracious, he's slow to anger. In verse 7 he says he's forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty. And you think, how does that work? How is God going to forgive iniquity, but by no means clear the guilty? Isn't that what forgiveness is? Isn't forgiveness of iniquity the clearing of guilt? It's this confusing thing. And I think the reason that he does this, the reason God presents both his mercy and his justice in this passage, is because we cannot fully understand God's mercy without first appreciating his justice. We cannot understand what God's mercy is without knowing that God is a God of justice. So in that first section, he lists several attributes that we can kind of summarize that as his mercy. He says he's a God merciful and gracious. He's slow to anger. That's a really interesting phrase. That's a lot of people say they really want a Bible translation that is literal. I want a literal Bible translation. I want a translation that tells me exactly what the text of the original language says. This phrase here, slow to anger, the phrase itself is erek apayim, which literally means God has a long nose. That's the literal translation. Now, in Hebrew literature, in Hebrew poetry, a long nose meant patience. A long nose meant someone who's patient with others. If we were to use the same figure today, a long nose would usually mean in our culture deception, because, Pinocchio, right? He tells a lie, and if we said to someone, your nose is growing, we'd say, I think you're lying. That's basically what that phrase means. But in Hebrew literature, the long nose meant slow to anger, meant patience, abounding in steadfast love. That's another interesting term. It's one of those ones where there's no real direct equivalent in the English language to the Hebrew to the Hebrew here of steadfast love. There's in several translations it's translated as covenant love, or as goodness, or as loving kindness. In the King James it's often translated as either goodness or mercy. It's one of those words that it's got so many different translations to it. They go in all sorts of different directions that we need to realize there is no direct equivalent to this word in Hebrew. Even when they translated the Bible from Hebrew into Greek, the Greeks didn't have a word that properly translated this. So they translated the word steadfast love as mercy in Greek. There's no direct equivalent in Greek or in English. And what the word really means, what the word steadfast love or covenant love really means, is an unmerited kindness based on the steadfast loyalty to a covenant. It is the unmerited kindness or love based on the steadfast loyalty to a covenant. So basically what that means is that God has a covenant with his people. God has an agreement with his people. And because of that agreement, on the basis of that agreement, God is going to show kindness and love that is not necessarily deserved, that is not necessarily equivocated. It's not necessarily God is getting the same kind of love and kindness back. It's that he is going to give that kindness and give that love to his people based on the covenant that he has with them. And God doesn't just have steadfast love. He doesn't just have covenant love. He abounds in it. It's something that he has, as the text tells us, he's keeping steadfast love for thousands, or we may read that as thousands of generations. He keeps it for all people, for all time, because he has this fierce loyalty to his covenant. So we see here there's all these attributes that are given there that all summarize to a God of mercy, a God who is presenting forgiveness and love constantly. He's presenting kindness to his people. And it's a very interesting claim, because the context in which this claim is made is crucial to our understanding of God's mercy. We need to understand what's going on in this passage to understand why God is so emphatic that he is a God of mercy. If we turn back to Exodus chapter 32, so a few moments before, we find the account there of the golden calf. If we're familiar with the story, we'll basically just recap the whole book of Exodus. If we recap the book of Exodus, we have God's people who are suffering in slavery in Egypt. And God's hearing their cries and hearing their prayers to deliver them from this bondage. So God sends Moses, and he sends Moses to deliver his people. He gives plagues to the Egyptians until the Egyptians finally relent and let God's people go. They're freed from slavery because of God's deliverance. And as they're fleeing from slavery, the Egyptians, they change their mind and they pursue Moses and the Israelites, and they're going to wipe them out. But God protects them because he parts the Red Sea, and the Israelites just walk straight across. And then the waters close back up again to crush the Egyptian forces. God protects them. He delivers them, then he protects them. Then when they go out into the wilderness and they face the Amalekites, God delivers them again. He gives them victory over the Amalekites. He protects them. He delivers them. Then he gets them out into the wilderness where he gives them a law. He says, okay, you're a people now. You're a nation out on your own. You are going to need governance. So he gives them a law. And what they do with that law is they enthusiastically accept that law. They think this is fantastic. We need a law. We need governance. So they enthusiastically agree to that covenant. What they say is actually back in Exodus 24. Exodus chapter 24 and verse 3. It reads there, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. This isn't a reluctant acceptance of the law. This isn't saying, oh, well, I guess he's done so much for us, so I guess we'd better do what he says. No, this is enthusiastic acceptance of governance. They're thinking, this is fantastic. What you've just described there, Moses, is the society that I want to live in. These are good laws. These are good rules. We're going to do all that. That's excellent. There's this enthusiastic acceptance of this covenant. They agree, and within those laws, we need to remember there is a rather emphatic law against idols. That you shall have no graven images. It's one of the important rules, one of those early rules in those rules that they agreed to. No idols. So they've been delivered, they've been protected, they've been given governance, they've enthusiastically accepted that governance. And then the first thing that we read about them doing is they build an idol. As soon as Moses goes back up the mountain to commune with God, they construct for themselves an idol. They build a golden calf, and they reject God almost immediately. After all that God's done for them, they reject God almost immediately. And that's basically the context in which we find this passage. They reject God, they've built an idol, and God is thoroughly displeased with them. God is angry at them because they've done this, and we think, well, fair enough. He ought to be angry. After all that he's done for them, as soon as they're left alone, the first thing they do is reject him completely and turn towards idols. Turn towards the gods of the Egyptians or the gods of the Amalekites, or turning towards anywhere but God. We think, fair enough, God ought to be angry with these people. And Moses goes up to plead on behalf of the people for forgiveness. And that's where God makes this proclamation. It is in the context of Israel's great sin against God and great rejection of God that Moses goes to plead for forgiveness. And that's where God makes this proclamation that he is a God of mercy, a God of steadfast love, a God slow to anger and forgiving iniquity. So that's how we need to understand how these things work together. I think sometimes we miss the significance that God is angry at sin. God is angry at sin. If we turn to Romans chapter 1 verse 18. It reads there, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. I think it's one of those things that for people to understand the gospel, when people come to a knowledge of the gospel, we want to focus on helping people understand that they are sinners. That we are sinners. We have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's what Romans 3:23 says. What I think is harder to understand than the fact that we are sinners, is the fact that God cares at all that we are sinners. The fact that God is angry at sin. That the fact that we have sinned and the fact that we've fallen short of his glory is displeasing to God. This is what this is. In the second part of this passage, in the second part of verse 7, where he says that he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. This is God's anger against sin. This is God's justice. He's displeased with sin. For God to be just and righteous, he cannot tolerate unrighteousness. If God is fully righteous, he cannot tolerate unrighteousness. He cannot let sin go unpunished. It is through God's justice that we must understand God's mercy. It is through that lens that we can understand God's mercy. So, how does all that work? I think the way that a lot of people view God's justice, the way a lot of people in the religious world view God's mercy could basically be summarized in the phrase, I like sinning, God likes forgiving, so the world is very well set up, right? I like sinning and God likes forgiving. Maybe we wouldn't word it that way. Maybe we'd say, look, I'm mostly a good person. I generally do the right things in life. But, sometimes I slip up and maybe there's a small deficit. Maybe there's this area in which I slightly fall short of God's glory. But if there's any small deficit, God's going to cover that. Because what else would you have a God for, right? Well, that's his job. That's why you have a God, is because he forgives that small deficit when I fall slightly short of his glory. If I mess up or if I slip up. The way we view God's forgiveness is often like a grandparent forgiving a grandchild, right? It's a very different relationship there. I don't know if any of you remember last month when we visited here. My youngest, she has one of the cheekiest and most mischievous smiles you will ever see. And when she gives Hannah or I that cheeky smile, we know she's done something wrong. We know she's misbehaved in some way. And we try and figure out what's going on. What have you done? Why are you acting like this? What naughtiness have you engaged in for you to be giving us that smile? But when she gives that smile to my parents, or when she gives that smile to Hannah's dad, it's a very different story. They go, isn't that cute? It doesn't matter what she's done. Isn't that little smile cute? Isn't that adorable that she's messed up and she's done something naughty and she's just giving us that cheeky smile? That's sometimes how we view God's forgiveness of us. That God is looking down on us at our sin and thinking, isn't that cute? Isn't that adorable that they're messing up in this way? That's not how God views our sin. There is no cute in the Bible. That's not God's basis of forgiving our sin is not on how cute we are or how good we are. Because I think a lot of us would be in trouble if that was the case. When we sin, God is angry at us. God is angry at our sin. There is wrath, there is justice at our sin. And rightly so. We may look quite critically when we look at the story of Aaron and the Israelites and what they've done, and we think, fair enough, God, you ought to be angry with them after all you've done for them, and they immediately reject you. But then when it comes to our own sin, we're like, oh, well, that's a different story. As if somehow our idolatry is less offensive to God than Aaron's was. As if the sin that we commit is somehow more cute, more adorable. We all fall into this category. God is angry at sin. So we need to understand that forgiveness of sin is not a light or a trivial matter. It's not something that we can presume upon. It's not something that we can just say, well, God will forgive, so it doesn't really matter what I do. It doesn't matter how I behave. It's not trivial. It's not something we can presume upon. The fact that a holy and righteous God who is angry at our sin willingly forgives us. That's astounding. That's incredible. That's something that ought to befuddle us. It's something that ought to confuse us. And we ought to ask, how does a just God, how does a holy and righteous God forgive sin? How can justice harmonize with mercy? The answer to that, of course, is that God's mercy and his justice are both fully on display in perfect harmony on the cross. It is the cross that shows us God's justice and his mercy in perfect harmony. So like the Israelites, we've all sinned and fallen short of God's glory. That's what Romans 3:23 tells us. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And as such, we're subject to the punishment. We're subject to the justice of God. The justice of a holy God Romans 6:23 tells us that the wages of our sin is death. There's a consequence to our sin. And the consequence to our sin is the anger of a just God. So God's justice demands that the punishment of sin be paid. But he also needs to demonstrate his mercy. He also abounds in steadfast love. So what God did is God came to this earth in the person of his Son. God came to this earth in the person of Jesus Christ. He lived a life without sin. He lived a life without committing sin or falling short of God's glory. And as such, he lived without being subject to God's justice. He lived in a way that he did not need to be punished. He did not need to suffer the justice of God. And in doing so, in living that way, he could adequately and he could appropriately take your sin upon himself and face the punishment that you deserve, face the punishment that we all deserve, and die on the cross. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 24 says, he himself bore our sins in his body, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. God administered his justice on sin and demonstrate his mercy on the sinner on the cross. His justice on sin and his mercy on the sinner. So God's mercy is not trivial. Well, I think when we trivialize God's mercy, we trivialize Christ's suffering on the cross. When we make these silly claims, this weird attitude towards sin that I like sinning and God likes forgiving, or that God is just there to forgive me my sins, we trivialize the suffering of Christ. We trivialize God's justice and his mercy together. God is merciful, and he is so willing to forgive our sins that he sent his Son to die on the cross in our stead. Our salvation is based on a seeming contradiction. Our salvation is based on the mercy of a just God. Those attributes, they're a contrast, and it's difficult to wrap our heads around them. But what we see from Exodus chapter 34, verse 6 and 7 is we see that God demonstrated his mercy and his justice to Israel at Mount Sinai. But we can also see that God demonstrated his mercy and his justice to us on the cross. That's the mercy that we are subject to. That's the justice that we are subject to. And we have that salvation through the mercy of a just God. Let's be upstanding as we sing the final song.